Hey there everyone, Monarch here. And well, you all seem to really enjoy the Elder Dragon video a lot. So much so to the point where it got over 9,000 views in the first month of its release. That is absolutely incredible. Like, for context, this is a number very few of my videos get, and when it does typically get to this range, it's only after like several months of waiting, maybe even a year or two. Not many videos of mine reach that high of a view count in so little time. And I cannot thank you guys enough for all the support. I legitimately thought that video was going to bomb because of the lack of teasings I was giving in terms of production of the video, in terms of how it was coming along or when it would be announced, and I figured that its sudden dropping after so long of waiting since the 2023 highlights would make it so that it failed, that it would flop. But you all ultimately proved me wrong, and clearly the video was interesting enough for you guys to all not only watch it, but also comment on. And I got a lot of interesting comments of people discussing their various opinions and perspectives on the Elder Dragons. And so I wanted to repay my thanks to you by making a sort of follow-up to the video, where in which, for this, I am going to be looking at some of your guys' comments, and I am ultimately going to reply to them. I am going to list them off here, and then talk about them, give my perspective on the issue being talked about, whether I agree or disagree with it, all of that and more. Now, of course, it needs to be said that, again, just like that video, this is all an opinion piece. This is not matter-of-fact discussion. This is not me saying you cannot think anything else, you are barred from thinking this way. Nah. The other thing is that this is unscripted. So, for those new to the channel, welcome! This is me in my ramble voice. This is me without a script to back me up. This is me more natural, and you're going to hear me ramble a lot, potentially repeat the same points. One final thing I want to say is that if you do not see your comments here, do not take it as a slight against you. This is not me preferring certain comments one over the other. Some of these comments that I chose, I explicitly disagree with, that I do not agree with at all. But ultimately, I can only include so many comments. There were over 80 comments on that video alone, and if I counted every single comment of every single reply, we'd be here all day. So I only chose a select batch, and those are the ones I'm going to talk about. So yeah, let's get started with this. Now, for the following comments I selected, they were discussing about a number of topics, so I decided to group them all together into various categories to approach this video with, and so it's not just all haphazardly put together and sporadic. So we've got 3 categories today, starting with by lore. These are comments talking about the world building, the Elder Dragons in the lore, the classification, all of that and more. So, first of all, we have our first comment here from Little LW319. And in this comment, Little is making the point that the encyclopedia, the list of entry in the encyclopedia, doesn't necessarily equate to the actual animal population, that there is more of the population in the universe. It's not just a single Teostra or a Geismagorm, and that, you know, just because the book may be filled with a bunch of predators and monsters like that, that doesn't mean that the ecosystems themselves are like that in universe. Most ecosystems are going to be comprised of herbivores and all that. The other thing to note is that their existence is a serious threat in the narrative. They're going to be destroying towns and villages, and there is the possibility that survivors of said incidents can report it to the guild, and then it can become a rumor and speculation. And that it isn't all that far-fetched to discover a new species every now and then within the setting. And I think this is a very good point to talk about, because we need to draw the line between within the game sense and within the world sense, which is something I think a lot of people get confused on when it comes to topics like this. We get so caught up in, oh, there's so many Elder Dragons in the game sense, that it's just one after the other, but it's not accounting for the fact that the world in itself, the narrative we are fighting and taking place in, is much different. That, of course, there are populations of these elder dragons out there. There are more members of the species. And the point about elder dragons becoming rumor is actually a very good point because it happens a lot in the narrative. As I said in the video, monsters like Velkhana are considered myths and fairy tales in the universe, so it's very possible that at some point in the distant past, certain people witnessed sightings of Velkhana and created a fairy tale or myth surrounding their exploits and what the Elder Dragon was doing, or maybe even that these reports became so fictitious and uncertain that it devolved into myth. And even when it comes to reports or sightings of Elder Dragons, Gogmazios was a rumored sighting because of him raiding guild warehouses and taking all of their gunpowder. It was such an unknown monster that nobody could determine who was the culprit behind these raids. And it wasn't until the first Dragonator was taken and recent reports in 4 Ultimate that Gogmazios was finally spotted and classified as the culprit behind those incidents. So yeah, I think Little brings up a very good point, and it brings to mind the argument and the idea that we need to keep in mind that there is a separation between the world in the universe and the game itself that we play in. And here we have in this comment Cowboy Barbarian arguing that the situation at hand is that they are bringing the monsters down to Earth. They are still extremely powerful, but like every other monster in the universe, they're still monsters. They're still animals that eat, that sleep, that have their natural lifestyle. And that if these members of the species, if the species as a whole is so renowned and successful in its tactics and in its population, that they should be as numerous as they are. And once again, we're bringing up the angle of the in-universe lore here, but also comparing it to real life, or in which the success of a species determines its reach and population. And of course, since it's a game, we can't say everything in the real world is going to apply to Monster Hunter. Monster Hunter tries a realism angle, a pseudo-realism in terms of utilizing facts and attributes about real life and incorporating them in the scenario. But even still, there are going to be quite a few differences, some things that are just impossible for our universe, which is why it's important to realize that it's not exactly our Earth, it's a different world. But even with that point in consideration, I still think that this is a good argument to consider, that this probably holds weight with something like the Rathalos, for example, and its species. I mean, just look at all the variations the Rathalos has, not just with things like Azure, Silver, or Dreadking, but also in terms of the regional variations, because that is an actual thing in the universe that not a lot of people seem to notice. The differences between a 1st and 2nd gen Rathalos compared to a 3rd gen, a 4th gen, and now a 5th gen, and potentially 6th gen, looking at Wilds, is that it isn't just because, oh, graphics and styles change, so thus the design is going to change. It's also because, in-universe, it's different members of the species appearing differently because of the environments they grew up in. And the same goes for something like Zinogre, where in which we see a clear difference in the old world members of a species versus a new world. So this actually isn't all that crazy of an idea to consider, that yes, Monster Hunter already dabbles in terms of species variations, so if there's a species of monster that can literally control the weather, that can control storms, lightning, floods, and more, that yeah, they are going to be successful in terms of ecology. They're going to be top of the food chain. They're going to populate more and more. They're going to branch off into other members of the species, other variations depending on the locale. They're going to be ecologically successful. Moving on, I think another good point of in-universe world building that people need to consider is brought up here by Martinsent, where due to the advancements in hunting and technology, that's one of the founding goals of the guild, which is to monitor and research Elder Dragon activity, is going to be more successful. And yeah, that's a good expansion upon one of the viewpoints I shared in the video as well. That yeah, of course our understanding of the Elder Dragons would shift as the world advances. And I like how Martinsent here adds into that fact with the Hunters Guild, that yeah, one of the main goals and pillars of the guild is to monitor Elder Dragon activity. Well, I mean, it's not just Elder Dragon activity, but it's monster activity as a whole, but let's consider for a fact that, like, yeah, if you had monsters as powerful as this in the narrative, just wandering around willy-nilly that could destroy entire towns and settlements in the blink of an eye, and can manipulate the weather and force of nature to their liking, then yeah, you'd probably put them to the top of your radar in terms of priority, that when there is something like the Elder Crossing, for example, happening, where in which, oh hey, all these monsters are moving towards some unknown location every few decades or so, and the time between each instance is decreasing, that yeah, we're going to explore it, because this is a major threat potentially. This is concerning in terms of the Elder Dragon's behavior, and something we need to understand, so let's send out these 5 fleets over the course of many years to research the Elder Crossing, and along the way eventually discover the New World, establishing trade and communication between them, and classifying, as a result, a whole new catalog of monsters native to the New World. And ultimately, that brings to mind the idea some people have, I've heard, with World as a criticism of its narrative, that it's about colonialism America, and how we are essentially playing as the colonizers and doing the same thing they did in terms of destroying the ecosystem. And that's that's just, I think, a bad comparison, because first of all, we're not even doing the same things colonial America did back in the day in terms of enslaving people, of having the civil rights movement, civil war, fighting against an oppressive power who's taxing us, and we're not, like, pushing the natives out of their habitats or anything like that, so there's not an indigenous people. Even then, with, like, the first Wyverians, there's no signs of that in the game, that we're actively pushing them out of our territory. They are very much willing to cooperate and tell information about the Elder Crossing and what's going on to us. That's one of the main fucking plot points of the game, where we have to talk to a first Wyverian and pass its trial of hunting a Rathalos and Diablos in order to understand what's going on, where Zora Magdaros is heading. Sorry about that tangent there. That's an analysis of world storytelling and its themes that I do not agree with at all, and it paints a really bad image of the 5 fleets, the guild as a whole, and what we're doing. Of course, make jokes about it a la Maxor style in terms of colonialism and, like, genocide the monster population, because yes, this is Monster Hunter, but, like, to actually take that viewpoint seriously, I don't agree with it. And again, the whole point I'm making here of this tangent is that the guild didn't go out to the New World and send its fleets to colonialize or enslave the population there. No, it was to report on the Elder Dragons and see where they're heading and what to make of the situation, and then they just so happened to stumble upon the New World. So yeah, context there, it's king. Bob is Uncanny here makes the good point about in-universe, the understanding of the Elder Dragons and the demystifying of them is kind of like the demystifying of the Kraken or other creatures that we thought existed in the past, and how the myth may be killed, but essentially the fear and respect of a creature like that remains. But he brings up the good points that the real issue is with Elder Dragons being portrayed in quest lines being the real issue. And this I can see, because Elder Dragons still are very significant in terms of the world building, but due to the way in which they appear in every game, they can kind of feel like an obligation, like I said in the video, in that sometimes they'll just feel brushed off. Like, okay, it's that time of the game where we now need to talk about the Elder Dragons or show them off, so here they are. And I mean, typically with this kind of idea, whenever this happens in Monster Hunter, usually it's always the main flagship or final boss that gets the most attention. Whereas other Elder Dragons like Teostra, Kushala, Chameleos don't really play that much of an impact in terms of a quest line. They aren't seen as dangerous as they usually would be. And it depends on the storyline in question, because in World, it's the Elder Dragons running amok, and we need to gather up research notes and find them and then hunt them down before they can disturb the ecosystem any further. While in Sunbreak, it's just, here they are again. And if it's for the same points I said in terms of World, I don't recall it being brought up in the quest line or by Chiche. I mean, maybe it was in one dialogue, but I cannot be asked to replay all of Sunbreak again just to verify that one fact, so I'm gonna leave it there for now. But alright, I think we've talked enough about the lore and in-universe implications about the Elder Dragons, and we're already quite a ways into the video, so let's go ahead and move on to our next category of comments, which is game design. This will be talking about game-to-game differences, how the monsters have changed over time and mechanics, and here we have Vengefly King making the argument that it is very likely the case of graphics as to why Elder Dragons are appearing so frequently and the systems at hand, and this is one that has a very real basis actually in the game's development and the series as a whole, because they make the point that in World, the vast majority of monsters were dinos and dragons. It was simple skeletons and monster types that could work with the environments and game systems at hand, whereas more complicated skeletons like leviathans and insects were not there. So, as such, they would use the monster skeletons that work, and we know this for a fact, because never forget, Lagiacrus was in a demo of World. Granted, it was a very early on demo, it was a prototype back when the Ancient Forest was super different, but ultimately, because of complications involving the skeleton, his animations, and clipping, they just couldn't get him to work within the game, and so as such, he was cut. And that was probably the case with a lot of other leviathans and more complicated skeletons like him. And yeah, that is a very real point to talk about, where we need to consider the plausibility of the developers and their time on the game. They don't have an infinite amount of time to work on a project. There is only so much they can do before the due date of when a game gets released, and ultimately, they have to play it smartly with what they choose to develop. If something ultimately seems like it will be unfinished and not worth developing, they're going to cut it. If it's going to cause too many complications, they're going to go for something much easier to implement. And yeah, that is the very real, unfortunate reality of game development, but it's one we have to consider. Ratatouille fan here makes the point that one of the reasons why Elder Dragons could be appearing a lot is that simply they're popular, and that as the graphical technology improves, they will have the biggest room for new innovations and changes. And he makes up the good point that, like, imagine there was a Title Update 6 to Rise, and it's an epic shot revealing Cephadrome. Yeah, it's a silly, ludicrous example that's never going to happen, but even if it was something like, say, Monoblos, which would be cool for older fans, it's ultimately not going to have the same hype as other Elder Dragons would. And the comment goes on to talk about a lot of other things I do not have the time to mention. And yeah, this is ultimately another good point of game development and how the fan base affects it. Simply put, title updates are here to keep our interest going, they're here to make the player continue playing the game, to keep them invested, and what better way to keep a player invested by bringing back a popular monster, by bringing back an uber powerful monster that is going to be challenging in the fight, that's going to require teamwork and effort, it's going to have brand new spanking powerful gear that's built for the end of the game, and yeah, that's another point. If there was something like Monoblos introduced as a title update, it would kind of have to fit with the rest of the endgame. They'd have to scale up its equipment, they'd have to scale up the armor and weapons, and they'd have to make it a good reason to hunt the Monoblos and why it should be a title update compared to literally any other Elder level threat monster or Elder Dragon that could have taken that spot. So that's a little bit of the harsh reality, once again, of game development and expectations. That is a bummer. Of course, I would like some of these monsters to be title updates, but yeah, it's just kind of expectations and all of that. This next comment here I'm going to be talking about is one I already responded to in the comments of the original video by Nathan Blackburn. And I'm not going to repeat over the whole comment once again. I'm mainly going to be focusing on the reply that I got afterwards, which clarifies their point of view and what they are talking about in the original post. And basically, the main point I can gather from the comment is that sometimes it feels like these Elder Dragons and powerful monsters are made Elder Dragons just because to be elder dragons. Like, it isn't to make them feel special or interesting in the world, and bring up points like all the other elder level threat monsters like a Cantor and Ducanlos that aren't elders but are elder level, that ultimately the addition of some elder dragons can feel arbitrary. And so if you've been hearing me agree a lot with these points and might be getting tired of this, well, here you go with something I'm not really sure about, because I don't really agree with this. I mean, ultimately, like all of these comments, it depends on perspective, and I can see for some people, depending on their reception of an elder, of a specific elder, if it's like, wow, did this really need to be an elder? But I'm not sure. Because you might say, oh, story obligation though. Typically in most of these stories, it's been an elder dragon final boss. So it's like elder dragons like Sharish, Valda, and Geismagorn are being created out of an obligation to be elders. And I just think that's a little disingenuous. I think that's a little bit skewed to consider all the development time and effort that these developers put into the elder dragons, into handcrafting their movesets, their designs, their concepts, their armor and weapons, and just saying it was because it needed to be an elder dragon. Like, Shara Ishvalda is just an elder dragon, essentially, that, like, it was made to be an elder dragon and it's arbitrary for that, even though I'd argue Shara Ishvalda, in my case, is one of my favorite monsters of all time. It really climbed up the list for me, not just because it's an elder dragon, but because of all the design motifs and inspirations that flood into its character. Every single ounce of its design, of its location, its music, its fight, everything about it is just dripping in Buddhist imagery, and it really makes for a unique, well-crafted monster that even to this day still stands out in my mind as one of the most impactful elder dragons I've ever fought. Like, yeah, some of these monsters are liked because of elder dragons, but the case oftentimes is that they're liked not because they are specifically an elder dragon, but because of other things about them. And ultimately, that depends on what you find worthwhile in this game. That depends on what you're looking for in these monsters. So ultimately, if you're viewing it just from the angle of like, oh, it was made to be an elder dragon, sure, but I don't know. So I'm not gonna dwell on it anymore. You guys can talk about it if you want, but that's all I'll say. Here we have a comment from Chief Keybeth. I'm going to assume that's how it's said. I don't know. Basically making the point that monsters like Kirin still stand out to this day because there's nothing really quite like it, and that we should have more of those weird dragons and not dragons in the Elder Dragon category. And yeah, I agree with this. Ultimately, while there are many monsters in the recent games that I like that share the same skeleton, it is refreshing ultimately to see other skeletons being used, seeing something different. Now, is that a dissing towards same skeleton monsters for me? No. And even if certain monsters still use the same skeletons, that doesn't mean they're out of ideas. I mean, look at Namiel. Even though Namiel uses the same skeleton as monsters like Teostra and Kushala, it is still one of the most unique elders introduced in the 5th generation, and it was so popular and unique that it landed at 18th place in the Monster Hunter 20th anniversary poll, and I don't think that's something to sneeze at. This was a monster that was recently introduced, maybe not as recent as Primordial, but was still fairly recent within the last 5 years, and yet managed to worm its way into the top 20 of 200 plus monsters. Like, that's insane. And then you look at Namiel and its fight, its design, how it moves around, and how slippery and interesting it is, and it's like, yeah, different things and unique mechanics can still be done even with the same skeleton. But ultimately, yes, I would like to see more of the weirdo elders, more of the strange what the fucks out there. And lastly, with Camille3545 making the point that if an elder dragon isn't tied to the story of the game, that it should be post-game content, that it should be like the older games where they were after the credits, after you defeat the final boss, and they were bonus challenges you had to fight, whether they were relegated to the village or in the hub. And I can see this point. I can see why. This all depends on how exactly the story is designed. Like, if it's all about this great big disaster that's affecting the ecosystem and causing the Elder Dragons to move out and become active, then yes, Elder Dragons are going to have to be included. They're going to have to be there in the progression, the story. We're going to have to put them down to curb stomp the activity, and we're going to fight the final boss. But, oh wait, no, even then, I guess that also depends on the kind of disaster, because something like Legiacris and Cedeus didn't have Elder Dragons in its village story. It was literally just Cedeus, but then that also depends on the monster roster in that game, because Cedeus was literally only one of 3 Elder Dragons introduced in Tri. Like, it's just Cedeus, Genmoron, and Elatrion, the other 2 being hub exclusive, big event fights and all of that. So it's not just story, now that I'm thinking about it. It's a lot of other factors, like monster roster. Voice crack there, my apologies, but yeah. A lot of factors to depend on and consider, so we'll just have to see how the next monster story deals with them, what Wilds is going to do with its plot line, and what kind of threats we're going to uncover, or maybe not even a big threat at all. Who knows? Okay. That's all in terms of the game design perspective. We are on to the last category of comments for this video at almost 50 minutes into the recording. My god. With the gameplay. We are talking here strictly their fights, their gameplay, their power, how difficult they are, all of that and more. And for my first comment, this is perhaps the most popular comment I got out of the whole video. It definitely seems to be the most liked comment at about 42 according to the screenshot. It may be at more as I'm recording this or whenever this video goes up. But here we have Zycro going on a point that if the Elder Dragons are going to have an endgame in every monster going forward, that they need to adapt, that they need to show off their strength in new interesting ways to be seen as mythologically powerful. And Zycro brings up a very interesting possibility in regards to Wilds, because as we know, Wilds seems to be focusing a lot more on weather effects from the one trailer we've seen of it. There's a massive sandstorm that rolls in, obscuring vision with the hunter and the monsters, and then later on in the trailer we see a thunderstorm roll in, and how there are lightning strikes littering the ground, how there are monsters that deliberately protect others by acting as lightning rods essentially, being struck with lightning. And Zycro here makes the comment and points that we could potentially see more of this weather manipulation effect in the actual game. And how, for something like Teostra, we could visibly see the air getting hotter, that there would be more heat distortions or particles in the air as Teostra ramps up in power, and that it could get to a point where we need to actively consume a cool drink because the temperature is rising until eventually supernova happens, and it's just this barrage of particles and heat waves. And this is a very interesting point that is brought up, and it's one I see, if not completely successful or fulfilled in its vision, at least partially. Because again, yeah, that seems to be the focus of Wilds. I mean, hell, even in World, we saw little weather distortions whenever a monster rolled into the map. Hell, Kirin is by far the best example of this, because a thunderstorm literally rolls into the Coral Highlands whenever it is there. It is storming in the distance. So, considering what we already have in World, I don't see this as a stretch of the imagination. This could very well happen in Wilds, and if so, it would be incredibly cool to see, and it would once again reinstate the power of the Elder Dragons. It would emphasize their effects on the weather first and foremost, and why something like Teostra is to be feared, even though we fought a lot of him as of recently, why he's more common. So yeah, this very beloved comment I see, and I agree wholeheartedly with this. This shows massive potential if this were to happen. Moving on from potential future ideas with Wilds, we have Stormjerk here giving us a few ideas of what could be done with the Elder Dragons. They argue to bring back the repel mechanic from 2nd generation, that it doesn't need to be a slog 7 hunt lawn endeavor, that it could just be the simple fact of if you don't kill them in time that they would be repelled. Just a few simple quests and that would be fine. As well as points like generally make the game harder at base to tone down the hunter power so that way they can feel more powerful. And the most interesting point by far, giving them Frontier's extreme blights as a showcase of their power. Okay, talking about these points, first of all, the first point, yes, that's a given. And I think one that most people will agree with in the video. Moving on. Second point, Now obviously I have not played a lot of the 1st and 2nd generation games. I have played a few hours of Freeman Knight, I have some footage of the village, but that's about all I have in terms of 1st and 2nd gen experience. So I'm going to be talking out of my ass when it comes to making assumptions, but at least for me, 3rd generation onwards, when it comes to repel mechanic, it really didn't happen a lot for me. The one big instance I can think about when it comes to repel was Cedeus, actually, and that was you would most likely not reach the threshold by the time you get to the 2nd phase with breaking enough of its parts, that way it crumbles the cave wall and progresses into 2nd phase. If you didn't fulfill the requirements, the quest failed right then and there, but on the flip side, Cedeus kept its health going into the next hunt, so eventually you would be able to get to that 2nd phase, because, yeah, that's right, it wasn't a slay of Cedeus that you did in Village, it was a simple repel. And then maybe Genmoron in terms of a few instances or close shaves I've had, but even then, I haven't had a lot of repels since the 3rd generation onwards, and ultimately I think repels is just a thing of naturally the game power and balance is shifting, and that repel isn't as likely as a scenario as it was back in the 1st and 2nd generation, where your move sets and power was much more limited, and so the possibility of timing out and needing to continue this another hunt was more possible. Now, could it be brought back just for the sake of it? Yeah, it could be. But ultimately, unless if there's an overall nerf to the power, like you mentioned in the 3rd point, then ultimately, I think it just kind of comes across as why bring back the repel mechanic? I mean, of course, there are going to be some people out there who naturally are repelling monsters, but unless if it's something like Kolv and Safi, which that might be the most modern example of repel, then repel is going to feel like a why bother? Like, why bring back this mechanic when most people are going to kill the monster anyways? Like, that's kind of the idea I'm getting at in my mind. So it's like either weaken the hunters and strengthen the monsters to make repel more possible, or you make more Elder Dragons and monsters that have siege-like mechanics, that have an intrinsic repel factor brought in, where you build up the meters and build up the mechanics involved in the siege, and then, oh, you'll get it next time, you'll complete the siege maybe in a few hunts from now. That's the only way I can see it. As for Zenith Blights, oh, I'm not sure about that. Granted, I'm the Frontier nerd. I love seeing more Frontier introduced in the mainline Monster Hunter. That said, considering where we stand right now in terms of Frontier inclusions with mechanics and monsters, I don't think Zenith Blights are possible right now. Maybe later down the line when we've introduced more absurd mechanics, when we've introduced crazier monsters, maybe. Because the Zenith Blights are also their own huge can of worms in terms of how crazy of a status effect they are. Like, burning away your whole life bar like that, in a snap, rapidly. Not just depleting your health, but actively depleting your max life. Or Zenith Thunderblight. You get hit one more time, you go into cardiac arrest. You fucking die. Or even some of the Blights, like Zenith Paralysis, where just, oh yeah, you just have essentially a small monster nipping at your ankles whenever you do fucking anything, whether it be chugging a potion in the middle of an attack animation, oh, just randomly get bit and interrupted in terms of animation. Like, the Zenith Blights are crazy, and they fit the endgame scaling of Frontier at that moment in time with the Zenith monsters and the Zenith updates, but brought back in their full capacity and ridiculousness, I don't think the Zenith Blights fits. Granted, yes, they do a fantastic job of making the Elder Dragons more threatening, but it might come at the cost of making players angry. So again, in terms of Zenith Blights, either at a later point in time, or if they are brought back, they have to be nerfed. They have to be toned down in terms of their ridiculous effects, because it's a little too much even for right now. As much as I would love to see people get angry and what kind of reactions that would cause, there's an inner sadist in me that absolutely adores the idea. But that idea, that perspective of me is also getting constantly argued down by the realist. So, yeah. Very interesting, though. Here we have Christian Cinnabars arguing their perspective on the Elder Dragon's strength. And the point they want to discuss is that the gap in power level between Elder Dragons and normal monsters are being drastically shortened. That when you fight monsters that can stand up to hurricanes, or normal monsters that seem to have as great of an elemental control as some of the Elder Dragons, that it kind of takes away from some of their power, their grandiose mysticism. And this is a case-by-case basis, I feel. Because obviously, Black Dragons, they are uncontested. They are unrivaled in power, they're the top dogs of the world, and naturally there's nothing like them. And for certain elders, that's also the case. Like, there's nothing quite like Shara Ishvalda in the world of Monster Hunter. There's nothing else using sound vibrations on that level of power. But then, if you consider monsters like Teostra with their flame manipulation, and then compare that to Silver Rathalos and Gold Rathian, they are these extremely rare species that are in-universe once-in-a-lifetime events, and how in Generations, Gold and Silver were along the same tier as Deviljho in terms of star rating, just right below the Elder Dragons. Whereas in Iceborne, and especially Sunbreak, they are directly on par and in the same rank as other Elder Dragons. We see these monsters take on Ushala or Bazelgeuse and other monsters around that power level. And I think that's fair in terms of something like Kushala, where in which one is actively being dwarfed essentially to make the other seem more powerful. But I think in terms of the star rating, I'm not too sure about that, because that's dependent on the game itself, and depending on the game, the star rating can change wildly. It could be in the context of the story, in terms of the locations, maybe even the current understanding of the world, or maybe even the variation in the species in terms of a local environment, like maybe New World metal losses and Ians are more powerful or different than their Old World counterparts and can thus be on the same level. Who knows, honestly. I think star rating is a little bit of a weird thing to talk about. I'm not too sure about that myself. I try not to delve too much into power levels because I think some people can take it way too seriously, especially power scalers, power debaters. Ugh. But I think, like, if you want to, say, offset these balance issues, that you'd then try and do something with the other Elder Dragons. That if you want to bring up the power level of Kushala, you give him something new to make him seem powerful. What that can be, though, depends. Whether that's a cutscene that has him beating down a monster, environment effects in the world, like we explained with the previous comment, or whatever else. Again, this depends a lot on perspective and what is done with the Elder Dragons. But we'll have to see. Delving back into the realm of possibility for a second here, we have Big Autistic Daddy's comment section here, which essentially goes on a line of how we could see Elder Dragons interacting in future games, where in which because of a storm a Kushala naturally creates that it wouldn't be able to notice your presence as easily, or maybe in the case of Nergigante, something like we get to see it actively hunt down other Elder Dragons in the world. And again, this is an interesting idea. This kind of delves back into the first comments of this section and what was being said. Now, as for if it would be a possibility, I'm not sure, because it's definitely more complicated than just simply writing a specific interaction like a turf war between two elders. This is an entire behavioral note about the monster, and it might be up to random chance and how that AI works. So for something like Kushala, I can maybe see it being more possible, because I mean, certain Elder Dragons in World and Iceborne were more passive than others, and you could literally sit right next to and nothing would happen. But as for something like Nergigante hunting down other Elder Dragons, that would depend on what Elder Dragon in question is also in the environment at that time, and how would this system even work? Like, is it actively hunting them? Is there unique interactions while it is pursuing them? Or does it devolve into the usual slap fights that have kind of defined multi-monster interactions for a while? Because outside of typical turf wars and some special interactions, monster interactions, by and large, are still kind of slap fights. Like, they're still randomly hitting each other with their attacks and effects and flinching one another, and I don't really think that fits the idea being painted here in this comment section about Nergigante. Like, it sounds a lot more intricate and in-depth in terms of Nergigante actively pursuing another elder. So, cool idea, but not sure how possible it would be. The last comment we got here in terms of the gameplay section is from Diane's Labber. And ultimately it talks about how with the normal Elder Dragons, so talking specifically about the ones that have different crown sizes and can be recorded in the field, that as time progressed, they started to feel more mundane and normal. Like, at first, Elder Dragons would make the environment around them completely devoid of life. There would be no other monsters or small monsters in the area, but that as the games continued, that started to change a little bit more. And this could have probably gone into the second category if I thought about it, but whatever, it's kind of a mix of both, and this is a good point to bring up, and ultimately it depends on the game being talked about. So with World of Iceborne, it's a case of wanting to encourage turf wars, wanting people to utilize turf war systems to gain the upper hand, and also in terms of the ecologist people, of seeing this small snippet of life, which that's a whole point I didn't bring up at all in terms of the video, but like, the perspectives in terms of whether you're someone who is ecology focused or gameplay focused, and how that ultimately impacts your perspective on Monster Hunter and its various ideologies and what you find important, yada yada yada. But point is, Turf Wars kind of served a dual example. It provided a gameplay focus for people who liked the gameplay, but also provided something for the ecology people, for showing this slight glimpse into the behavior of the Elder Dragon and their strength. That said, yeah, I do really agree with Rise and Sunbreak. I really don't want it to sound like I'm hating on Rise and Sunbreak, that I'm a certified hater, but like, oh my god, I do not like the wire bugs, I do not like the wyvern riding, and ultimately, I get that it was to emphasize further that gameplay perspective, but I think it came at the detriment of the Elder Dragons, of the ecology, that it became redundant in gameplay, it was overpowered as all fuck, and it just kind of made monsters your bitches when it came to their threat level, and most egregiously, the fact that even Elder Dragons were weak to wyvern riding. That excluding monsters like the Serpents and Geistmagorm or Amatsu, that they could all be wyvern rided. They're all easily handled, just like any other monster. And oh my god, that pisses me off so much. You have no fucking idea how much that angers me. Whereas meanwhile, all these slightly angry, scarred monsters can resist it unless it's with 2 people because reasons, because trauma, and it's just, oh my god, it's so dumb, it's so fucking stupid, and I hate it so much in terms of downplaying the Elder Dragon and their strength. Like, I was pretty tame. The whole point in saying, oh yeah, I think the Elder Dragons are pretty powerful, pretty mystical all around even now. But like, this is the one exception I agree with wholeheartedly that they were downplayed in. Oh, sorry, tangent. Yeah, I agree. Ultimately, I think this depends on the game in question and the mechanics introduced. If turf wars are going forward, then we're going to see turf wars being emphasized more. We're going to be seeing, hopefully, more gameplay reasons and more ecology reasons. But if it's something like wyvern riding, yeah, it's going to come at the expense of the Elder Dragons, and that's the point where I agree wholeheartedly. I think ultimately they need to consider how the games are being designed, the mechanics being introduced, and try and balance it out. But alright, that was the last comment of the video. Or I would be saying, if it actually was, because there's one more I've got here. A comment that I couldn't really place into any other category because it was so strange, it was so weird in terms of hypotheticals that I couldn't resist making its own category. This is by Take Zokyo Mura, if I am pronouncing that correctly, which makes this big crackpot theory that we could have a cataclysm event in Monster Hunter erasing Elder Dragons. Like there's some big disaster, like the Legend of Fatalis that comes about, that eliminates a good portion of the Elder Dragon population, that exterminates certain species, and how, because we defeat Fatalis in Monster World, Iceborne, they could bring him back as Crimson, and that could be an excuse to fulfill the prophecy, and make this big cataclysm event. And there have been a few cases in not other Monster games, but in certain games where there's this big event that impacts the entire world. I think of the Cataclysm in World of Warcraft. Same with Bahamut in Final Fantasy XIV. So it's something that can happen in a game, but it's a very situational thing. Like, I'm not sure about why World of Warcraft did it in regards to the Cataclysm, if there was some game design reason, or if it was just for the sake of a big story event and redefine the maps. But with 14 and Bahamut, this was because the original 14 was literally a train wreck in game development. It was an absolute failure in UI, systems, gameplay, all of that and more. And it was crashing so fucking badly that the only way it could be saved was by temporarily pulling the plug. We are going to be pulling the plug on the original 14, canonically destroying it in this big event that people can engage in the original 14, but is ultimately irreversible. People cannot stop the moon of Dalmud from falling. It results in this grand old cutscene. By the time the countdown ends, 14 is gone. But in its place, a realm reborn happens. The world is canonically reset. We can rebuild the systems from the ground up. We can rebuild mechanics, the world, make it a canonical event going forward with the 7th Umbral Calamity. So I'm not too sure about the possibility of there being a great purge like that in Monster Hunter. Because for all of our complaining in terms of the Elder Dragons, if there is a problem, let's all keep in mind that on the game development angle, there really isn't a problem. When it comes to the story, the problem gets resolved within the same game. And in game development wise, nothing's happened. I mean, the most it's been is with something like Zora Madros, where it was this year of arduous development to even get it working. But even then, that didn't play into the rest of the game. Ultimately, the most they decided to do with Zora was just not have him return. In Iceborne, he just wasn't there. You could make his armor, but he wasn't there. Same goes with the Rampage and Thunder Serpent Narwa in Sunbreak. They aren't there. So, not bringing stuff back in future games is a possibility, but the basis for a great purge hasn't been laid. And then in regards to the Legend of Fatalis, I'm not going to go into that because Monster Hunter lore and canon is a crapshoot in terms of canonicity and speculation and misinformation. I'm not going to talk about that because parts of the Legend of Fatalis are in Iceborne, like with the disasters happening as Fatalis is awakening, but nothing about the legend being reborn, about when the world is full of wyverns, the legend is reborn, meat is crunched, bone is snaps, yada yada yada. Nothing like that is in the games or has been translated. A large part of Fatalis' lore has been rebooted, and a lot of the misinformation or legends the old community had just doesn't exist nowadays with the modern Fatalis. So, ultimately, this is a fun idea. This is a very interesting idea, but I don't think it's possible. Alright. Oh my god, I should not have included 20 comments into this poll. I should have probably tried to limit it down further considering how much I can ramble, but there you go. That is me responding to some of your guys' comments and giving my perspectives on certain issues and what I think about it and all that and more. And I hope you all enjoyed. Oh fuck, actually, if there is one extra thing I'm going to bring up in terms of the comments is that out of all the points I argued in my video, out of everything I used, I was most surprised by the points of people arguing that I shouldn't count variants or risens into the numbers of the Elder Dragon. The main points I want to argue with why I did that was that I'm talking about strictly a game design perspective. I am not arguing about the lore, about them being the same species. I am arguing strictly about the game. I am looking at the notebook in each game, looking at what has a unique entry, and what the Monster Hunter Wiki classifies as a new monster introduced in that generation. So, things like Ruiner Nergigante, they have separate notebook entries. They are counted as their own separate monsters in the game. Whereas something like the AT was not counted because they are not separate monsters. They are a buff status to these Elder Dragons, similar to Frenzy, Apex, and Hyper. They are not different monsters within the data of the games. And okay, if you disagree with that point of view, if you disagree with my opinion, let's take a look at the 20th anniversary poll real quickly. And oh, wait a second. Variants and risens are counted as separate entries in the 20th anniversary poll. Well, there you go. So even if you disagree with my perspective of counting the risens and variants, word of God, by Capcom, by the Monster Hunter team within the 20th anniversary, deliberately sees the risens and variants as their own separate monsters introduced in the franchise. So yeah, I'm sorry if that sounded a little bit smug of myself, but I just wanted to illustrate the point of why I counted the variants and risens in the video and ultimately dispel any rumors or misinformation about it. But I promise, that is the last thing I am mentioning for this video, and that is where I am ending this video. Thank you, everybody who is watching this video right now and who watched the original video as well and commented here. I greatly appreciate all your guys' support. I cannot thank you enough for making it such a massive success on the channel, and I hope that you guys enjoy this more unscripted, not so serious approach to discussing your guys' opinions and what you think about this issue that I try to bring up as neutral as possible within the video. But I try to illustrate all the points and then see what you guys think. Maybe if I do more videos like this in the future with the Elder Dragons in terms of discussing something and then asking you guys to write out your opinions and comments, who knows? I might make more of these in the future, but we'll have to see. that's for future Monarch to decide, because right now, present Monarch needs to end this so that way future Monarch can have an easier time with editing this nonsense. But anyways, I have been the Monarch of Dragons, and I hope you all have a fantastic day / night wherever you live. Peace, and Inclus Volt.